Committee on Natural Resources will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on unleashing America's energy and mineral potential. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements may be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3.0. Without objection, so ordered. Good morning, and it's great to see everyone here for the first formal hearing of our committee as we kick off the 118th Congress. House Republicans made a lot of promises last year, and now the American people have given us a majority, and we are ready to deliver on those promises. As we put together our legislative agenda for this Congress and heard from our constituents, it was clear that energy independence, energy security, and lowering consumer cost was a top priority for our country, and therefore it's a top priority of this committee. Energy and minerals affect every part of our daily lives. Just look around this room, and we flipped on a switch to turn the lights on. We're enjoying temperature-controlled environment, and we're receiving text messages and emails on our cell phones. From the visible to the invisible, energy and minerals are woven into the fabric of our very existence. And given this dependency, you would think that the administration, regardless of party affiliation, would be finding every possible avenue to unlock America's potential to produce these necessities of life that we've all come to depend on so much. Instead, we've seen an attack on the production of American oil and gas, on American mining, which translates into an attack on the economy of America. And it also doesn't help the environment out one tidbit when we're importing these products from countries that do not have near the environmental standards, near the human rights standards, or can produce these materials as efficiently and as effectively as we can here at home. We are exporting wealth from the United States to many times to our adversaries because of a not in my backyard mentality. Well, we hope to change that mentality and give a message to the American people that we're blessed with resources here in the U.S., that we can develop these resources, that we're committed to research and to development to make these resources the cleanest, safest, most effective use of resources in the world, and promote more human rights and more dignity through the use of resources, provide people with the necessities of life, the opportunity to improve their lives and to enjoy the benefits that the energy development in this country has given not only to America, but to the rest of the world. There may be a narrative out there that, and I know from some of the organizational meetings we've had, that Republicans only care about the bottom line, that we don't care about the environment. I would say that's contrary to the truth. Republicans care about the environment and the economy. And we know that if we produce more of these products here at home, we benefit both. We benefit both greatly. And we hope to be able to talk about facts. We want to look at what the real science is. I've said many times that the problem with the Democrats, and especially this administration's policy, it's two things. It's physics and math. They seem to ignore the science, and they ignore the math and try to create this idea of a utopia that right now is centered around electric vehicles. I have no problem with electric vehicles, but they're not going to solve the world's problems. They're not going to solve any kind of climate crisis, and they're certainly not going to make America more energy independent and energy secure. There's a chart behind me. You have a copy of it at your desk, and I hope you will take this chart and study it. This is global demand for energy, global use of energy, actually, over time by energy source. And if you study that chart, you will notice that the world was mainly using biomass in 1800, but you had the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s, and you see coal come onto the scene, and the global usage of energy doubled from 1800 to 1900. And if you follow that chart and you see the increased industrialization of the world, the global consumption of energy doubled again by the 1940s. Then it doubled again in the 1960s, it doubled again in the 1980s, and it doubled again just a couple of years ago. And the statisticians are projecting that it'll be 50% more by 2035. The world has an insatiable appetite for energy. And I hope you will look closely at that chart. And I wish President Biden had looked at this chart before he made the comment last night that we need fossil fuels for 10 more years. Fossil fuels on the global energy scene make up over 80%, closer to 85% of the world's energy production. And that's not going away. And while we're hyper-focused on electric vehicles, that if you could change every electric vehicle in America, or every passenger car and light-duty truck to an electric vehicle overnight, you would reduce carbon emissions globally by less than 1%. While we're focused on that, China's building coal-fired plants every week. It's imperative that we look at the resources we're blessed with, that we develop those with the best technology and innovation possible, and that we do what's best for the American people and for the world. I'm going to not close. I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to recognize the ranking member for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, one of the extended prerogatives of the chair is that you can finish whatever, and please do. If you have more on the subject.
We will have plenty of discussion during the hearing. I want to keep it moving along. If the ranking member would like to make an opening statement, I will yield you 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here and taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us and to travel here. And I want to. There was a moment yesterday during the President's State of the Union speech before Congress that I thought was almost like an epiphany, in that we reached a discussion about common ground. And that common ground effectively said, Social Security and Medicare are off the table. We don't have to worry about those being part of any cut list, and we're all going to work together to make them stronger. I thought that was a rare and good moment in which, on the surface, seemed to have the vast support of all the members of Congress that were there. So that was a special moment. And I would hope that as we look at the issues that are before us today, and before the jurisdiction of this committee, that we look to try to find some common ground on some issues. But I don't think today is one of them. Last week, 4 big oil giants, Exxon, Shell, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, reported the largest profits in history. Together, these fossil fuel Goliaths made over $1 trillion in sales in 2022. Needless to say, big oil had a good year. And on the other hand, the climate did not. The drying of the West showed no signs of slowing down, sending the Colorado River reservoirs into historic shortages and demanding of the federal government and Congress that they intervene in that crisis that continues to grow, the drought in the West. The hurricane battered Puerto Rico, ripped through Florida, making it the deadliest hurricane to hit the state since 1935. All told, the cost of climate disasters in the U.S. totaled $165 billion last year and claimed far too many lives. Climate change is a public health, safety, environmental, and existential crisis like we've never known before. And I think because of that, Democrats on this committee continue to be to push the issue that climate must be a central focus of any legislative consideration, and that the progress that we've made into a transition away from total dependency on fossil fuels, 85%, as the chairman said, to renewable, alternative energy sources that are clean and healthy for the world and for the American people, that continues to be central in what Democrats of this committee will continue to advocate for, fight for, and push for legislatively. This committee helped pass the most significant investment in climate action in history with the Inflation Reduction Act, the Democrats in this committee. The IRA includes $369 billion in investments for community hit hardest. That includes $4 billion to address the drought in the West, almost $3 billion to build more resilient coastal communities, and of importance to the discussion today, to boost federal permitting offices and environmental review processes so that the self-fulfilling prophecy of no resources, no staff, and permitting taking longer and longer feeds the same argument over and over again that somehow this is a deliberate attack on energy production in this country. $1 billion to bring that permitting process, expedite that process is in there, and we should support its implementations. We made great headway in taking serious actions on climate, but it looks like my colleagues across the aisle won't be building the momentum anytime soon. Instead, we've decided to dedicate this first hearing, their first message to the American people, how to make it easier for polluters to prosper in this country. During today's hearing, you'll hear about the need, quote unquote, streamline permitting, and to quote, unleash our energy potential. But before we get all hung up on these catchy slogans and they lure us into a drill baby drill frenzy, let's call them for what they are. They're nothing more than the industry's newest buzzwords, designed to trick the American people into giving them what they want. And what do these industries want? They want to hoard more of our public lands, despite the fact that fossil fuel industry already has thousands of approved permits across 26 million acres that they aren't even using. They want to, quote, streamline permitting by stripping us of public input, the public's right to know, despite the fact that they already ignore and trample all over environmental justice communities. They want to fast-track drilling and mining projects. I'm on my time right now, sir. So they can make more money more easily, despite the fact that they are already raking in trillions by taking corporate handouts and ripping off the American taxpayers. They want Republicans to do their bidding to make it happen, which they seem all too willing to do. But no matter what happens, no matter what Republicans want, the American people have a different vision for the future, and that involves dealing with the climate crisis, continuing the momentum toward a transition away from fossil fuels, and making center in all discussions and legislative actions going forward. What does this do, and how does this abate, mitigate, and remediate the issues around the climate crisis? With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Now yield back.
Ranking Member yields back, and as you can see, we're going to have a spirited discussion today. I look forward to delving into a lot of those charges made by my colleague, and I think we can. I think the record will show that Republicans are on the side of the climate, they're on the side of the environment, and we actually have solutions that work. And to be able to have this discussion, we've got a great panel of witnesses before us today. I want to introduce our witnesses from panel one. We have Mr. Eric Melito, President of the National Ocean Industries Association here in Washington, D.C., Mr. J.C. Sandberg, Chief Advocacy Officer from the American Clean Power in Washington, D.C., Ms. Dana Johnson, Senior Director of Strategy and Federal Policy for We Act for Environmental Justice from Washington, D.C., and Ms. Kathleen Sagama, no stranger to our committee, who's President of the Western Energy Alliance in Denver, Colorado. Let me remind witnesses that under committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. To begin your testimony, please press the talk button on the microphone. We do use timing lights. When you begin, the light will turn green. When you have 1 minute left, the light will turn yellow. And at the end of 5 minutes, the light will turn red. And I will ask you to please complete your statement. I will also allow witnesses on the panel to testify before member questioning. The chair now recognizes Mr. Melito for 5 minutes.
Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify. My name is Eric Melito, and I'm president of the National Ocean Industries Association, or NOIA. At NOIA, we represent all segments of the offshore energy industry, including offshore oil and gas, offshore wind, offshore minerals, offshore carbon sequestration, and other emerging technologies. Our members include not just energy developers, but also the businesses, large and small, that do the work of building, supplying, and operating offshore energy projects. The same U.S. companies in the supply chain that have built out the U.S. offshore oil and gas sector are already participating in the build-out of the U.S. offshore wind sector and are leading U.S. efforts to develop carbon capture and storage infrastructure. The offshore region, and the Gulf of Mexico in particular, have served as the backbone of U.S. energy production for decades. The U.S. has been producing oil in the federal Gulf of Mexico waters since the 1940s, and production in the Gulf has been steadily increasing over the past 30 years. In fact, this region has been producing more than 1 million barrels of oil per day since 1997, and hit its highest level of production on record, just over 2 million barrels per day, in August of 2019, right before the onset of the pandemic. When compared to countries around the world, the U.S. Gulf of Mexico would be the 11th largest producer of oil in the global marketplace. In terms of energy affordability, production from the U.S. Gulf of Mexico plays a substantial role helping to meet global demand for energy. The U.S. Gulf of Mexico oil and gas sector truly is an economic engine. It supports about 370,000 jobs, and these jobs are dispersed throughout the country. U.S. oil and gas production, and Gulf of Mexico production in particular, provide Americans with the best product when it comes to low-carbon barrels. Oil produced from the Gulf has a carbon intensity 1/2 that of other producing regions. U.S. offshore facilities are state-of-the-art, built with efficient modern designs that help to serve and prevent emissions and deliver high volumes of oil and gas with a smaller physical footprint. Policies that restrict domestic offshore development require imports to make up the shortfall, and that supplemental production comes from higher emitting operations in other countries. Foreign providers generally employ less environmentally protective production methods, which, when combined with the added emissions from importing oil over great distances by tanker, increases the amount of carbon released into the atmosphere rather than decreasing it. U.S. offshore wind is poised for dramatic growth. Offshore wind development in federally managed waters offers enormous economic and environmental benefits and will help meet renewable energy goals. While the development of U.S. wind opportunities will provide substantial benefits to states adjacent to lease areas, it will also lead to tremendous investment throughout the nation. In areas like the Gulf Coast, you will find steel fabricators, offshore service vessels, subsea construction companies, helicopter service providers, and more who built their experience in the oil and gas industry but will be vital to building offshore wind. The U.S. Gulf Coast region is also uniquely situated to emerge as a global hub for carbon capture and storage, or CCS. CCS has been identified by experts throughout the world as key to meeting climate objectives. Along with excellent geologic prospects for storing carbon dioxide, the Gulf Coast is home to the full supply chain of energy companies with the engineering expertise, experience, and vision to deploy CCS projects with the scale and efficiency necessary for success. U.S. energy policy should support the development and availability of all forms of abundant, reliable, and affordable energy supplies for Americans, while continuously reducing impacts and driving down emissions. Whether it is offshore oil and gas, offshore wind, or offshore CCS, the federal government must provide a pathway for investment through certainty in leasing, permitting, and regulation. Failure to do so will not prevent the investment. It will only prevent the investment from occurring here in the United States. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Melito, thank you for your testimony. Now I want to recognize Mr. Sandberg. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is J.C. Sandberg, and I am the Chief Advocacy Officer of the American Clean Power Association. ACP is a leading national clean energy trade association that unites over 750 utilities, developers, manufacturers, purchasers, and transmission companies focused on deploying utility-scale onshore and offshore wind, solar, storage, and hydrogen. The clean power industry has become a significant part of our nation's energy mix. Today, over 15% of our nation's power comes from wind and solar. Enough wind, solar, and battery storage have been installed to power 59 million homes. The clean power industry provides 443,000 American jobs and contributes to local economies across the country by delivering over $2.8 billion annually in state and local taxes and landowner lease payments. And we are poised to see significant growth over the next 10 years with expanded investments in clean energy. These investments will unleash further economic growth, create more good-paying American jobs, lower energy costs, improve our nation's domestic energy security and independence, strengthen the reliability and resiliency of the grid, and lower carbon emissions. But a key hurdle to the future development and deployment of domestic clean energy is our current federal permitting system. Successful deployment of clean energy resources requires a predictable, timely, and cost-effective permitting framework. However, the current process is anything but. It takes an energy generation project like a new solar or wind farm an average of 4.5 years to obtain necessary NEPA reviews. To put that into perspective, a project that begins review at the very beginning of a presidential administration will not be completed by the end of the term. For transmission projects, it's even worse, taking an average of 6.5 years. Some reviews can take as long as a decade. These delays create uncertainty and raise costs for project developers and consumers, as projects are typically not allowed to proceed without a completed NEPA analysis. Meanwhile, loans and other financial obligations must be met, and materials must be purchased and stored. There is also the opportunity cost. Money invested in a project waiting to break ground could be invested somewhere else, impeding further clean energy deployment and job creation opportunities. Permitting challenges fall especially hard on energy production located on federal lands and waters. Although federal lands have the capacity to host a vastly larger number of clean energy projects than they currently do, the cumbersome federal permitting process makes it much more attractive to invest on private lands. For offshore wind, projects that are built almost exclusively in federal waters, we are also seeing significant delays due to an inefficient and outdated permitting approval process established nearly 2 decades ago. Addressing our permitting challenges at the federal level will be critical to the future development and deployment of domestic clean energy. It is possible to implement common sense reforms that strike the right balance of timely decisions for projects while preserving thorough environmental reviews and maintaining collaboration with state and local stakeholders. ACP is encouraged by ongoing efforts and various legislative proposals from both sides of the aisle, including the Transparency and Production of American Energy Act that Chairman Westerman introduced in the last Congress. The TAP American Energy Act contains key provisions that would advance the clean energy infrastructure development and deployment in the U.S., while not undermining our bedrock environmental laws by, among other things, putting clear timelines on NEPA reviews and eliminating requirements of duplicative environmental reviews and analysis. Without common sense reforms, like the ones outlined in the TAP American Energy Act and further detailed in my written testimony, America will be unable to reach our full clean energy potential. ACP looks forward to continuing to work with this committee and Congress on these important issues. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sandberg, for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chair, Ranking Member Grijalva, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this important conversation. We Act for Environmental Justice is a Northern Manhattan-based member organization whose mission is to build healthy communities. We do this by ensuring that people living in a community of color or an area of low income lead in creating sound and fair environmental health and protection policies and practices at the city, state, and federal level. Our Federal Policy Office also serves as the administrative anchor for the Environmental Justice Leadership Forum, which is a network of 50 EJ orgs and advocates that represent 22 states and really work to ensure that their interests are represented in policies and practices at every level of government. Today, I am here to offer you two considerations as you begin the important deliberations on how best to legislatively ensure that our energy economy addresses the climate crises, is accessible and affordable, and protects those who have a history of being adversely impacted by fossil fuel operations. I want to start by urging you to keep environmental justice at the forefront of your policymaking. 18 million people live within 1 mile of an active oil or gas well in the U.S., including a disproportionately large number of communities of color, people living below the poverty line, older Americans, and young children. More than 1 million African Americans in places like Texas, Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia live within a half mile of an existing gas facility, and that number is expected to grow. Members of the Navajo Nation in New Mexico are twice as likely to live within a half mile of an oil and gas facility compared to the rest of the state's population. And more than 1 million Californians live within a half mile of an active oil and gas facility, and of those million, 50% of them are of Hispanic origin. We know that race, more than income, is a primary factor in our land use decisions, and as a result, we see greater adverse health impacts from fossil fuel operations in our communities. These include early death, heart attacks, respiratory disorders, stroke, asthma, and absenteeism at school and work. And the financial cost? An estimated $886 billion are spent annually on health impacts from pollution related to fossil fuel operations. Please know that people living on the front line and fence line of fossil fuel operations want you to take action to address our energy needs, but they want you to ask yourselves 3 critical questions along the way. Are you creating an environment for producing or expanding an energy source that will harm communities? Are you perpetuating racially and economically disproportionate health and environmental burdens? And are you prolonging the climate crises in communities where climate change is centered? We hope that your answers to these questions will be no. Second, I urge you to uphold the democratic process that our current permitting legislation provides. We repeatedly hear 3 concerns in our work. How do we ensure energy democracy, a just transition, and uplift the need for creating justice in permitting? How will we fast-track traditional and clean energy projects in a way that does not perpetuate land grabs on indigenous lands and undermine indigenous sovereignty? How do we impress upon you as legislators to focus on permitting in a way that protects our voice and provides recourse? The National Environmental Policy Act has been called the People's Environmental Law. Since its inception, NEPA has been copied in more than 185 countries. In the United States, 16 states have written their own little NEPAs for state-level projects. NEPA is so influential that many call it the Magna Carta of environmental laws. By giving people a voice in federal project planning, NEPA is a key tool to advance our democracy and environmental justice. Public participation is an opportunity for impacted communities to provide critical input for the just and sustainable implementation of a project that could significantly affect their health and surrounding environment. We need time to organize our responses to long technical documents, and in an effort to decrease that process, like those related to energy decisions, is extreme and it's undemocratic. I want to close by requesting that you consider the Environmental Justice for All Act, which was introduced in the 117th as HR 2021. It's community-led legislation, and it addresses public comment periods, proactively considers alternatives, considers cumulative impacts, and focuses on meaningfully consulting with tribes. When these things are done, projects move at an appropriate pace. Again, we strongly support the reintroduction of the EJ for All Act in this session of Congress.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair now recognizes Ms. Sagama for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I my written testimony is there. I think I'm going to deviate a little bit because I feel the need to address some of the statements. You know, calling the oil and gas industry polluters is just simply misinformation. We work hard every single day to ensure that we are reducing environmental impact, and we produce oil and natural gas more sustainably and more environmentally protective than any other country in the world. So when you talk about energy, let's get realistic. You know, I had to laugh when the president said that we'll have oil and natural gas for the next 10 years. Well, his energy agency, the Department of Energy, predicts oil and gas consumption will continue to rise through 2050. And it will continue to rise beyond that. They just project to 2050. And that's because oil and natural gas provide a huge benefit to humanity. They provide environmental justice for all by providing affordable, reliable energy. Let's look at the impact from so-called clean energy. When you call us polluters, what about the huge mining waste in the Congo? What about the slave labor in China? What about all the minerals used? And I would note all the petroleum that goes into solar panels and wind turbines and all the minerals they need. So there's an environmental impact for any source of energy. We work hard in the oil and natural gas industry to make sure that our environmental impact is reduced and managed. We don't shove it over to Congo and to China and other areas of the world. We manage it here in the United States, and we do so more cleanly than anywhere else. So when the president has to go to Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia to get oil and natural gas because he's trying to stop federal oil on public lands, then he's bringing in something that has a higher environmental impact, that's produced non-sustainably, and that increases greenhouse gas emissions. The oil and natural gas industry is the #1 reason the United States has reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than any other country. It's because of the increased use of natural gas as an electricity generation source. We have reduced more greenhouse gas emissions than wind and solar combined because we're reliable, we're on 24/7, unlike intermittent wind and solar. So we pick up the pace when wind and solar cannot provide any energy. We back up wind and solar. We enable wind and solar. When those EVs need to run, they're running on coal and natural gas. So we're proud to be providing the energy that Americans actually use. And when it comes to environmental justice, there's a reason there are a lot of oil and gas wells in the Navajo Nation, because the Navajo Nation develops its energy for the benefit of its people. It provides livelihoods for the Navajo Nation. We return about $96 million to about 20,000 individual Navajo mineral owners every year. That's environmental justice. That sustains their livelihoods. And when we are in communities, when we operate near communities, we don't choose what communities we find oil and natural gas in. That happened millions of years ago when the oil and natural gas was baked under layers, geological layers, millions and millions of years ago. So we develop where we find it. And in the West, we are not hoarding public lands. In fact, we are down 71% from a high in the 1980s. There used to be about 168 million acres of federal lands under lease. Today, it's under 25 million. And from that 25 million, only about 450,000 acres actually have any surface development on them, whether it's a well pad, a road to get to that well pad. So we are producing much more from federal lands with much less impact on the lands. So I just felt the need to address some of that misinformation. I look forward to discussing NEPA and the Inflation Reduction Act and other ways that Congress can put more sanity into our oil and natural gas regulatory environment, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Thank you for your testimony, Ms. Sagama. We're now going to go to member questions. And first, we'll recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here this morning. I have here in my hand a letter from Laura Daniel Davis, Principal Deputy Assistant Director at the Department of Interior, dated December 8th, 2022, that has some very interesting statistics on the Biden administration's approval rate for applications for permits to drill. So, Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to, and it's to me and 43 of my colleagues. I asked unanimous consent to introduce this letter into the record.
Without objection.
Specifically, in this letter, the Biden administration is taking credit for what the Trump administration accomplished. This letter states, quote, the BLM approved 5,145 APDs, applications for permits to drill, in fiscal year 2021, surpassing the fiscal year 2020 total of 4,600 approximately approvals. This period includes the last few months of the Trump presidency, when the Department of the Interior was approving APDs at an unprecedented rate. According to a 2020 GAO report, APD review times decreased from 196 days to 94 days between 2016 and 2019. Curiously, the Department of Interior is no longer publishing its month-by-month breakdown of approved APDs, which previous administrations have done. So, Ms. Sagama, can you please talk about how the APD approval process has changed under President Biden? What's that doing to American energy production?
Well, I think initially the rate it's been fluctuating. The monthly rate of approved APDs has been fluctuating. Would we wish that the federal bureaucracy could be more consistent in approving permits? Certainly. And sometimes if there was more regularity and more certainty on when we'd get a permit, we wouldn't have to request permits so far in advance. But generally, we have seen the rates kind of fluctuate, coming and going. I think when it comes to federal lands, we're a little bit more concerned with the games being played on the leasing side. Because if leasing dries up, as it has with the initial Biden ban on leasing, then we're really concerned about future production. But the permits have they've stabilized. We're getting permits, not as quickly as would be efficient, but I think we're more concerned about the leasing aspect right now.
Okay, and a similar question. Our friends across the aisle like to bring up the fact that there are 9,000 approved permits to drill across the U.S. which remain unused. And so the implication is that energy companies are derelict in their pursuit of their own interests, to pursue energy and make a profit and create jobs off of that. But aren't there a lot of reasons why an APD not be used? And could you elaborate on that, Ms. Sagama? And what can be done to make those 9,000 outstanding APDs more usable?
Sure,
If that's what we all really want.
Yeah, I appreciate that question, because when the press secretary brought up 9,000 permits about a year ago, it certainly raised the issue. There are about 8,600 permits that have been approved that have not been used yet, and that's as of September. So we don't know the actual up-to-date number.
Why?
Well, there are a variety of reasons. As I mentioned earlier, the inefficiency of getting a permit means that companies often request permits years in advance, because if you have started a project, we drill wells really quickly now. We're so efficient and we drill so many on a well pad, that you can't afford to start your project, drill 1 or 2 wells, and then have to wait for 2 2 more permits because you're going to put, whatever, 8 wells on that pad or whatever it is. So in order to stay ahead of your rig, you need an inventory of permits. And since you don't know if it's going to take 6 months or 2 years to get your permit, you often get those permits in hand before you even start the project and have them in hand for a couple of years in advance. So that's one of the reasons. The other is simply you might be waiting for a right-of-way from the federal government. You might be waiting for, in order to get to your well pad, you have to get across a piece of federal land, so you need a permit for that. You might be held up waiting for an air permit. So there are other reasons that we don't use those permits right away.
Or litigation?
Yeah, well, we've just had a case last week in New Mexico where a judge called into question about 370 permits in New Mexico. We have litigation from environmental groups on about 4,000 permits in New Mexico and Wyoming.
Thank you,
Absolutely.
Thank you, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gago, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Westerman, Ranking Member Grijalva. As we have conversation in this committee around permitting reform, and I don't doubt we will have a lot of them, we can't lose sight of why talking to people who live near these infrastructure projects is important. We know that frontline communities are more likely to be harmed by air and water pollution from mining and drilling projects. These includes tribes and minority communities. So we need a permitting system that allows clean energy projects to move forward in a timely way. But we can do that while still making sure that impacted communities have a chance to participate in the process and protect the air and water they use to survive. We can do both, and we should do both. To that end, I have a question for Ms. Johnson. In the Inflation Reduction Act, Democrats provided almost $1 billion for permitting agencies to ensure these reviews are efficient and effective while still capturing public input. From your perspective, how will this help improve NEPA's reviews going forward?
Thank you very much for the question. We know that the 2 leading reasons why projects don't advance is because they were underfunded and because the NEPA process was not followed. Making nearly $1 billion of resources available provides opportunity for the government to staff up, to modernize systems and processes so that projects can move forward appropriately. As was noted, the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure package, includes the financial resources to be able to move work forward. And so when we have the financial resources to move a project forward and we follow the NEPA process, then things move at an appropriate timeline. When we don't, when we try to undermine communities, when we try to skirt around processes, then we find ourselves having to take a step back and look at recourse, legal opportunities, and be sure that we've done the appropriate work to be sure that a project moves forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota, the chair of the Subcommittee on Energy and Minerals, Mr. Stauber. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate all the witnesses. I want to thank you all for your testimony. I'd like to start by noting that the Nonpartisan Energy Information Institute projects significant increases in global and oil and gas demand for the next 5 years. Ms. Scamma, it's great to see you, and thank you once again for joining us today. The importance of your membership to American energy security is not lost on me. However, as you stated so clearly in your testimony, we need to update our broken permitting process so your producers can produce. Rolling back the 2020 NEPA rule was a mistake. Could you elaborate a little more on how agencies focusing on hypothetical project impacts isn't grounded in reality, and how harmful that rule has been to your membership and to Americans nationwide?
Thank you for the question. And I would agree with Mr. Sandberg. Groups are using NEPA to slow down wind and solar projects as well. We saw with the 2020 rules just sensible reforms to put appropriate page limits and time limits and focus NEPA on the actual impacts at hand. Because, I agree with Ms. Johnson. We want communities to be involved. The NEPA process has public comment already baked into it. It's part of the process. But what was happening is NEPA is taking 5, 10, 15 years for roads,
20
bridges.
20 sometimes in a mining community in mine. Go ahead.
Yep. But even for roads, like they're adding cost for communities all across the country and taking 10 years to build a road to do NEPA, because often the agencies are requiring the project proponent to do basically research projects. So instead of actually focusing on the impacts from the project, they have to do hypothetical studies on, cumulative impacts on other projects together with the project at hand. So they have to consider all these things that are far related. We're getting requirements to do greenhouse gas analysis, not from the project, but all down the line to try to imagine what the end user is going to do with that oil or natural gas. So hypothetical research far beyond the impacts of the project at hand, and certainly far beyond the impacts of the communities at hand.
Thank you very much. Mr. Melito, thank you again for joining us. We understand and appreciate the work your membership does for our nation. As you noted, a barrel of oil from the Gulf accounts for half the emissions of oil developed abroad. However, this administration only offered 2 offshore lease sales, jacked up the royalty to disincentivize participation, and then didn't defend it in court. If global demand is rising for oil and your membership provides a smaller emissions profile, what do you think a 5-year plan should look like that meets global demand challenges with the most efficient development in the world?
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the question. And a lot of arguments are made that our industry, we have enough leases, but those arguments really ignore the fundamental realities of the energy business. Whether it's oil and gas, solar, wind, you need acreage to develop the resource. The more acreage, the more energy you can produce. And to get acreage, you need leasing. And offshore is a region that is still an exploratory business. So when you get a lease, there is absolutely no guarantee that it's going to produce oil or natural gas. Companies spend between $100 and $200 million to determine whether or not a particular lease even has oil and gas, and most times they come up empty. So having a predictable, regularly scheduled plan for leasing is vitally important. We have an opportunity to go from the 1.8 million barrels today we're producing. The estimates are if we have continued leasing and continued permitting, we get to 2.4 million barrels. We also can go from 370,000 jobs to 430,000 jobs. But to do that, we should have at least 2 lease sales per year in the Gulf of Mexico. That will also help out offshore wind because under the IRA, you need offshore oil and gas leasing to issue the wind leases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Quickly, Mr. Sandberg, thanks for joining us. Yes or no? Does American Clean Power understand the necessity and benefits of domestic mining to your industry? And does American Clean Power support domestic mining?
Thank you for the question. We support the reshoring of supply chain, and a part of that we think is continuing exploration for critical minerals domestically.
So you support domestic mining? Is that what you said?
We support the reshoring of the supply chain.
That's all you got. Do you support domestic mining or not? Do you support mining in Minnesota or not?
We support the mining of critical minerals in the U.S. to prevent
Thank you.
supply
You and I
chain
are going to
back
have a
the
great
US.
conversation. That's all. I appreciate the answer because I had to actually pull it out of you, and that's kind of
The gentleman's,
concerning. But thank you very much.
gentleman's time has expired. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I represent the south coast of Oregon, 250 miles of the most beautiful coastline in the United States. Sorry, everybody else, but I do. And we're on the forefront of seeing the effects of climate change, whether it's wildfire, because we have federal and state and private timberlands, drought, ocean acidification. So I firmly believe that we need to move to green energy, move away from fossil fuel, and move to green energy resources as quickly as possible. I also am one of the few people in Congress who's actually run an agency. I was the labor commissioner, so I ran the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And one of the things that I found was coming into an agency was that there was a lot of bureaucracy and rules that people didn't understand. And it made the things that were written at a law school or graduate school level, which meant that vulnerable workers, small businesses, couldn't understand the process. So I also think, I do think that many of my Republican colleagues across the aisle think that the solution to that is to privatize government work or to just decrease or wipe away regulation. And what I think is we need to ensure that we have protections for workers. We need to have high environmental standards, right, for anything that we do. But there is a way to do it, and I think as Democrats, we have to acknowledge that the process is difficult so that my community, we're weighing in on potential offshore wind, but the tribal communities, the low-income communities, the fishing communities that want to weigh in on this, the business community, they need to be able to access the information, which means that that process could be shorter without decreasing the standards if we make it more accessible. You shouldn't have to, no offense to lawyers, but you shouldn't have to hire a lawyer to weigh in on what's happening in your community. So I think we can do both and I am happy to work in partnership with anyone to make those things more accessible, more reasonable, and for normal people, no offense to lawyers in the room, for normal people to understand what the rules are. So I think we can do both of those things. But my question is for Mr. Sandberg. So, and I did prepare for this hearing, and I saw that American Clean Power highlighted an article on the 100,000 new jobs already created by the Inflation Reduction Act, which Democrats passed last Congress. The clean energy tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act also will make sure workers are paid prevailing wage, and the projects that use workers from registered high-quality apprenticeship programs, like the ones I oversaw as labor commissioner, will be utilized. And I think that's important as we build our workforce, because I don't care what side of the aisle you're on, workforce is critical that we expand and invest in. So could you share more about the jobs being created thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act?
Thank you for the question. It's an exciting time for the clean energy industry, and as the industry continues to grow, we continue to employ more people. As you mentioned, the most recent Inflation Reduction Act included some provisions for certain labor, to use certain types of labor, and the industry has supported that and continues to work with government to get a workable framework around that. But we are excited as the industry continues to grow across the value chain at the jobs that are coming, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's installation and development. So it provides a rich opportunity for us to continue to grow both the domestic workforce and the domestic manufacturing base.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Curtis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and a special thanks for this hearing today to our witnesses. Before I move to my comments and questions, I want to address some comments that were made in opening remarks that seem to imply that Republicans only care about fossil fuels, that we want to oversubsidize the industry that we own and are responsible for the great profits that they've had in the last few months, that we're all about drill, baby, drill. None of these comments are helpful to a productive dialogue. I'd like to quote from an article at the Wall Street Journal Opinion Board. The name of the article is Joe Biden's Big Oil Profits. To quote, "Behold the irony, President Biden has done more to enrich big oil and its shareholders than Donald Trump or any other White House occupant in decades." It goes on to say, but big oil companies are merely benefiting from supply shortages and production constraints the administration has helped to create. I gave my staff a 3-minute drill. In about 3 minutes, they found over $100 billion of subsidies to the fossil fuel industry in the IRA and other Biden legislation with carbon sequestration, biofuels, and direct air capture. So I'd just like to point out this narrative is not accurate, it's offensive, and doesn't help move the conversation along. Now, turning to our guest today, I'm pleased, Mr. Sandberg, to be here with you again. You and I shared a few minutes out in my district where we talked a little bit about your industry and the branding of your industry. And one of the comments that I made at that point was, I think Republicans feel that we've been falsely branded as somehow not liking clean energy and renewables. And I think it's misconstrued with our thoughts that it's not the only answer to our energy future, but that we also feel like that you're an important part of our mix and what we're doing. I'd be curious what your feeling is about this whole permitting issue, how much it's restraining you, and what we need to do about it.
First, it was a pleasure to be with you in your district and to share some time with you. I think I think there is an ability to provide common sense reforms to NEPA processes. We're not suggesting for a second that we undermine kind of the bedrock environmental laws of this country, but there is an ability, I think, to make some common sense reforms to do this, and I think the Congress can do that. What does that do for the industry? Like any other industry, capital chases not just returns, but it chases certainty and wants to avoid risk. And I think these delays in permitting introduce uncertainty into the mix. So to the extent that we can take some of that uncertainty out by having a more regular and consistent permitting process, that's going to help us deploy more clean energy.
It's almost going to sound rhetorical, but it must be asked. Can we move forward in quicker times, more predictable times, and still be good stewards?
I don't believe they're mutually exclusive, sir. I think we can do both.
Yeah. Ms. Agma, do you want to comment on that as well?
Sure, I think we can do both. I think the problem arises when certain people and politicians promise that we can just replace oil and natural gas in 10 years. I mean, at the start of the Obama administration, we were supposed to be gone in 10 years. So let's be realistic about how these energy sources work together. And let's recognize that wind and solar are facing the same NEPA delays that oil and gas are. So let's work together and make NEPA a reasonable process.
So a couple of points. I was tempted to joke, and you've now prompted me, and please understand, I'm not serious, but the comment last night about fossil fuels being here in 10 years kind of makes me want to say I'm pretty confident renewables will be here in 10 years, right? And they'll be part of our energy mix. We all know, and if you look at the chairman's graph over there, we need all of you. And we need all of you to be on your game. And we need all of you to be working towards reliable, affordable, clean energy. And if you can't all achieve that, we're going to be short, all of you. And I think that's very important. I also want to point out that I don't know a single person on my side of the aisle that wants to undermine the environmental standards in NEPA. But to a person, I think we say it takes too long to get an answer. And once the answer comes, there's no certainty. And that needs to be fixed. It doesn't matter if you want to put in wind or solar or pipelines, all of that needs to be fixed. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Alaska, Ms. Patola, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I represent Alaska, and Alaska really depends on oil and gas development. So much of our state's economy, households, about a third of our households are part of that sector, and it pays household bills. But at the statewide level, it is the vast majority of our revenues that make sure that the state is doing its constitutionally required obligations of schools, public safety, public transportation. And so we're very serious and earnest and absolute about our need for responsible development. And at the same time, I think to a person in Alaska, they could give you about 50 examples of climate change. We had 5 snowless winters. It's impacted almost all of our species. We have a lot of species in crisis. So we, as Alaskans, we really are balancing these two things. But to my great surprise, not everybody knows about NEPA. When I came here, I was shocked to find out that people on the East Coast don't know the acronyms that are just part of our vernacular in Alaska, a FEIS and a ROD and all of those things. But one of the things I'm very concerned about is public input, because that is integral to the NEPA process, is that iterative process of preferred alternatives and getting to the perfect compromise. And I just wondered, Mr. Sandberg, this question is for you. How can Congress help support the efforts of companies you represent while ensuring local community input? And is the EIS process for development projects sufficient for local input?
So we appreciate the question. I think from the very beginning in the earliest stages of clean energy development, our developers are engaging with communities. They have to, in an open and transparent way. And I think that as we do that, we find that oftentimes project opposition comes from many forms, but also oftentimes is full of misinformation. And so as we engage early in that process, both disadvantaged communities, local communities, as we seek permits from state, local, and federal agencies, we find that early, frequent, sustained engagement helps us find a more smooth process. Do I think that there can be reforms to the NEPA process? Absolutely, right? I think that there are some common sense things that we can do together that, and many of those we've detailed in written testimony, and we're happy to engage on, but I do think there are some process improvements that can be made on NEPA.
And then I have a question for you, Ms. Johnson. And as I mentioned, I want to ensure local communities have a clear seat at the table. And I firmly believe that residents know best, and they know better than anyone how to protect their environment. And do you think that industry is doing enough in that regard?
Thank you for the question. I think that it is important for industry to look holistically at the impact of a project. And so taking the time to hear from people who have a real lived experience is critical. I think taking the time to do an environmental assessment so that we are considering the cumulative impact and exposure that people might have to a particular project is important and necessary. I think it's a false narrative to suggest that to do those things is too detailed and it's too costly. We, as I stated earlier, incur cost when we go around community, when we don't consider them. We incur cost because we did not appropriately plan or budget for a project. And so I think that to reference, a comment earlier about, hypothetical studies, being unnecessary. We don't think that they're hypothetical. We think that they're important. They consider the economic, the environmental, the public health impacts, and what that might cost us. And it's important for us to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
And lady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When you think about everything that we require just for our survival, not to mention the quality of our lives, everything is either mined or it's grown. That's the only way to get it. And yet this is precisely what the environmental left has targeted to suppress for the last generation. And as I pointed out recently, it's ironic that on the one hand, they tell us we have to produce millions of new batteries for everything from electric cars to the industrial grid. And then on the other hand, they're doing everything they can to shut down the exponential increase in mining that these so-called green policies require. Our prosperity requires not only the mineral resources that mining produces, it also requires cheap energy that fossil fuels produce. Last night, President Biden told us that the supply chain needs to start in America. Well, by God, the supply chain starts with the raw materials required to support everything that our economy produces and that every family depends upon for its survival and its comfort and its security. And that's precisely what this administration is bringing to a standstill. I mean, look at this war on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels produce 80% of the electricity in our economy. They produce it far more cheaply than wind and solar. Yet the very first act of this administration was to cancel the Keystone Pipeline, which today should be delivering about 800,000 barrels of crude oil every day into American markets. According to a study that was released this week, if the administration had just continued the energy policies of the Trump administration, America would be producing between 2 and 3 million barrels a day more than we are. Instead, we're begging Venezuela and Saudi Arabia to produce more. So much for Made in America. And that's why fossil fuel prices are skyrocketing. If you're upset about record profits for oil companies, that's what's making those record profits possible. When something is scarce, it becomes expensive. When it's plentiful, it's cheap. Trump made it plentiful, and on Inauguration Day, the average price of a gallon of gas was $2.59 a gallon. Today, it's $3.48 and rising. Where the hell do they expect the electricity for their electric cars and trains and stoves to come from? If you deliberately were to set out to destroy the prosperity of working Americans, is there a more effective way to do that than dramatically restrict mining and drilling and then divert these limited resources from their most economically productive uses to the ideological hobby horses of the woke environmentalist left? Wind and solar are among the most expensive ways to produce electricity, and as Ms. Sagama pointed out, unreliable wind and solar require conventional energy in order to maintain the electrical grid. That usually means running gas turbines at ready reserve in order to switch over the moment a cloud passes over a solar array or the wind falls off. Ms. Sagama, what future do you foresee for our country if these policies continue?
Well, I agree with you. When we make energy scarce, we make it more expensive. And who does that hurt the most? Not the wealthy. It hurts low-income communities. It hurts disadvantaged communities. Having access to abundant, affordable energy it's the basis of human welfare.
So these policies are impoverishing working Americans, low-income Americans, and at the same time, our friends on the left says they really want to help these folks. Does that make any sense at all?
It doesn't make sense to me. And that study you mentioned, we could have 2 to 3 million more barrels a day production here in the United States where it's produced in an environmental manner. That means that we're sending about $100 billion from that same study overseas instead of enjoying the tax benefits of it here. That the taxes that come from oil and gas sustain communities, sustain vital services. It's, what funds the government is, private enterprise.
It's productivity, exactly right. Government doesn't finance the private sector. That's the private sector that finances the government, and that's what they're shutting down. I'm reminded of Leo Tolstoy's line. He says, "I sit on a man's back, choking him and making him carry me. And all the while, I assure himself and anyone else who will listen that I'm very sympathetic of his plight, and I'm willing to do everything I can to help, except by getting off his back." I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Dingle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Too many treat economic security, national security, and environmental security as mutually exclusive goals, rather than the means to secure real climate protections. It's clear we need to accelerate our transition to a clean energy economy, but to meet our climate goals, Democrats have secured a historic climate investments in the Inflation Reduction Act and enacted a game-changing bipartisan infrastructure bill. But there is more real work ahead of us. Deploying zero-emission technologies at scale across the country will be the greatest permitting challenge in generations, and we must build in ways that do not do harm to our communities or degrade our environment. The climate crisis demonstrates repeatedly that our economic security, national security, and environmental security goals are completely interconnected and demand permitting solutions that match this urgency through both efficiency of review and inclusivity of voices of the communities most affected. I welcome my Republican colleagues' interest in permitting reform. For me, I look at permitting reform as a tool to combat climate change, strengthen our economy, and protect our national security. But we must bring everyone to the table to do this right. We must continue to ensure that frontline communities and those who are fighting to protect their homes are heard. We must cement a critical mineral supply chain here in America. It's critical. We must confront climate change and advance the electrified transportation industry that will lead our way forward. And personally, as the spouse of the man that originally wrote NEPA, I know we've got to protect its original intent and fine-tune it for today's realities. It's not an either-or problem. It's a necessity for a prosperous American future. Ms. Johnson, as I mentioned, Democrats have had a historically productive last 2 years. Between the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, we directed billions to improving our infrastructure and deploying renewable energy. As these projects begin benefiting communities across the country, why is it important that we ensure community input is key in the design process? And can you highlight the specific importance of the NEPA process in our transition to a clean economy?
Thank you very much for the question. I want to start off by just reflecting back on some of the conversation that we're having about the economic benefit of the oil and gas industry. I think that we are having an incomplete conversation in this space. We are talking about the jobs that people have. We're talking about the tax dollars that might be invested in a community. But if we aren't also talking about the $400 billion that we are estimated to have to spend to defend our coastlines, if we aren't talking about the $886 billion of healthcare costs associated with oil and gas operations, we are having an incomplete conversation. So thank you very much for your question. I think that people living in communities have a vision for economic prosperity, for health prosperity. We must ensure that people are at the table designing those projects to ensure that it's reflective of the lived experience that they've had. We've been traveling around the country asking officials in the federal government to meet with communities and local and state leaders. And people have shovel-worthy projects that they are ready to have deployed in their communities. And if we have folks at the table contributing to that ideation, that decision-making process, we will get the best result from our investment in both of those spending bills.
Thank you. To my colleagues, I want to say we need an honest conversation about permitting and the implementation of NEPA in the 21st century. And this is going to mean we need a meaningful bipartisan collaboration. We can accelerate deployment by becoming much more efficient and predictable with clear timelines. We can expedite permit review by rebuilding staff capacity in the federal agencies. We can ensure local communities have meaningful and timely input and retain the right to judicial relief when the federal government gets it wrong. And we can end, and then I'll stop, Mr. Chairman, but I really want to work with you on this because it's key to everything. We can end the environmental injustices of sacrifice zones by evaluating the cumulative impacts of projects in the communities already overburdened with unhealthy levels of pollution. We can do all of this without rolling back bedrock environmental and health protections. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Ladies, time has expired, and I appreciate the offer to work across the aisle and the recognition that we need to streamline, we need to do something different and do something better going forward. I now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany, the chairman of the Federal Land Subcommittee, for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take that as a guarantee that the Inflation Reduction Act is going to speed up NEPA because we're going to have a lot more bodies in the agencies. That's what I'm hearing out there, is that we've got a guarantee that with more bodies, we are going to see NEPA speed up. Ms. Johnson, you cite in here some of the costs, 1 in 5 deaths worldwide, more than 10 million deaths per year as a result of various cancers, things like that. When you do your analysis of trade-offs in your organization, do you look at trade-offs? Do you look at lives that are saved as a result of having affordable energy?
So we consider the economic, the health, the environmental impacts of policies and practices when we are evaluating their efficacy.
So in regards to that, so for example, the life expectancy in the United States of America since 1900, it was about early 50s, 52 years old, something like that. It's now in its mid-70s. Is that considered? Infant mortality was 1 in 10 in the year 1900. It's now like 7 in 1,000, something like that. It could have changed a little bit over the years. Are those things taken into account? Because affordable energy was part of the reason that those great advances were taken or were made. Does your analysis take into account the good things that happen also when assessing trade-offs?
So again, we look holistically at situations. To go back in time, as you've done, we also look at the impact of land use decisions like redlining, like
So if-
decisions that we make to center people in undesirable areas.
I really appreciate-
To center
I really
oil
appre-
and gas operations
I
in
really-
places
I really
where
appreciate that.
people live and build on top of it
Ms. Johnson,
without
hold it.
consideration
I have a
the-
really limited amount of time, only get 5 minutes to ask questions. If you would show me your analysis, just send it to my office, all the things that you put into your analysis. We would love to see that. Who's not following the NEPA process? You said that you're not being able to put input in and stuff like that. There needs to be greater input. That's required in the NEPA process. Who is not following the NEPA process that we should really get after here because they're not allowing the input that should be allowed? Can you name a project where they are not following the NEPA process of proper input?
So I have a list here, which I am happy to share with you.
If you would share
of
that with-
12 projects where the NEPA process was not followed.
If you would
and
do that, I would really appreciate it. I'd love to see that. Did you mention the Navajo tribe and that there were concerns there in your opening testimony? Did you read? You perhaps don't have this documentation, but in our next panel, we're going to have a group that's going to talk about mining, and there's going to be a group from the Navajo tribe that is talking about the great things that mining have done for their tribe. Obviously, there's trade-offs. Would you like to see that testimony about the good things that are happening as a result of mining with the Navajo tribe?
So I think what you are raising here is a principle of environmental justice, and that is self-determination. But people have to be at the table
So final
in
question.
order
And
to contribute to that kind of decision
They were
making.
clearly at the table, and they still are.
And so
Final
if
question.
it results
Final
in
question,
what you are
Final question, Ms.
referencing,
Johnson,
then
is,
absolutely.
does your group take any, organization take any money from the organization called Sea Change?
I have no awareness of that.
Okay, do you know if any money your organization gets goes back to, we understand that there are Russian and Chinese dollars that are going into some environmental organizations. Do you know if, have you tracked that at all to see if your organization has taken any money?
I have no awareness of that.
Okay. Well, it's important to be aware of that. I want to turn to Mr. Sandberg. And number 2, in regards to reforms of NEPA, you said establish a lead agency to spearhead environmental reviews. There's not a lead agency for environmental reviews?
Thank you for the question. I think that we need to strengthen the ability of a lead agency to drive all the various members of the federal family toward conclusion. And I think that's one of the process reforms that could be important as part of this permitting reform process.
So we don't have a lead agency. That actually is actually news to me and very unfortunate. Mr. Melito, will the USA be fossil fuel free in 10 years?
No,
Why not?
because we're going to rely upon oil and natural gas for decades to come. We're going to see a huge increase in the use of renewables, but the oil and gas portion of our energy portfolio is also going to continue to rise substantially.
So the American people should be disabused of this notion that we're going to end fossil fuel use in 10 years.
Absolutely, that's not reality.
I yield.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Comager Dove. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for always pronouncing my name correctly.
So many of my colleagues across the aisle have discussed increasing our dependence on fossil fuels, and all of our districts are impacted by the effects of climate change 12 months out of the year, as well as our dependence on fossil fuels. I don't think science cares if you're a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent. My diverse, largely black and brown district is home to one of the largest oil fields in the country. Instead of working to bring environmental justice to communities such as mine who have been negatively impacted by our dependence on fossil fuels, we are discussing expanding the practices that have caused serious health problems for these communities. Ms. Johnson, I have a question for you. We know that pollution in all its forms has an unacceptable and disproportionate burden on Black and low-income communities like those in my district. Although one of my colleagues just yesterday from across the aisle said that because the Black population is so small, it doesn't matter if we are killed by pollution. Whites and Cajuns are of greater concern. With all due respect, I think Black people are important, and Black and low-income communities are forced to continue to bear the brunt of a changing climate, from heat islands and drought to difficulty obtaining disaster assistance. Now our colleagues are pushing for even more fossil fuel development that would only add to these risks and potentially kill more of us. So could you answer how this would impact vulnerable communities across the country? Sure. I first want to note, I do believe that the White House Council on Environmental Quality is the lead agency around NEPA. I think it's important for us to be sure that their contributions to the rulemaking process is acknowledged. So to answer your question, I think in every stage of oil and gas life cycle, from extraction to distribution, there are negative impacts on communities across the U.S. As I noted earlier, because of redlining and other land use decisions, we most feel that in places where people of color and people of low income live. I think specifically environmental justice communities are a part of that process. We experience water contamination during the refinement and distribution of oil and gas. Toxic pollutants are emitted into our air, and all of the health impacts that I noted earlier are a part of that. And so I think that we need to ensure that we aren't continuing to perpetuate those disproportionate harms. We need to look at how we equitably and justly transition our energy economy in a way that is affordable, but also is done at a pace where, frankly, people feel comfortable that they do have family-sustaining wages, that they do have their credentials and their education considered in, setting labor standards and wage opportunities. We need to be sure that we are preserving people's pensions and things so that that transition occurs in a meaningful way. So I think I'll stop there. I hope I answered your question. Yes, you did. Thank you. And a question was asked about which where the NEPA process was not followed. I think you said there were 12 projects where it wasn't. I have a little bit of time. Would you like to share what some of those projects are and what can be done to help them do what they're supposed to do? Sure. I think what I wanted to offer up is when the NEPA process was not followed, the federal requirements were not followed. We saw places like oil and gas leases in New Mexico for the San Juan Basin not consider climate impacts in the NEPA process, and that slowed it down. When we look at a federal coal moratorium in California, not taking into account NEPA analysis slowed down that project's process. When we look at leases in Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, inadequate NEPA processes that did not consider greenhouse gas emissions from drilling and downstream use slowed down projects. We see more of this in different places across the country. When we don't follow our process, we delay projects. The framework is not the delay.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Rosendale, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for assembling this panel. It's a very informative group here today. Like the representative from Oregon, prior to arriving here, I was responsible for regulating an agency myself, the Securities and Insurance Agency in Montana, and I discovered a lot of subjective language which lent itself to the delays and increased costs, not only for business, but that translates into increased costs for the consumers as well. I do think that the clarification of necessary rules and the repeal or elimination of rules that merely generate paperwork is extremely helpful. And I did so when I was the insurance commissioner in the state of Montana. Ms. Gamma, thank you so much for coming here today. I appreciate it. In Montana, we have so much untapped potential when it comes to undeveloped energy resources, particularly in oil and gas sector. Much of this stems from the reasons that you've outlined in your testimony, namely overregulation and significant NEPA delays. The BLM's nearly unlimited discretion when it comes to, and I quote, every lease, permit, and any other oil and natural gas decision on federal lands has made it close to impossible to actually break ground on any of these projects. I'm currently working with this committee in consultation with partners in the private sector to introduce a bill, as you say, to clarify leasing minerals. That interior must hold quarterly lease sales where the lands are available. My question for you regarding that is, what else, in your opinion, is the agency likely to come back with to slow down or stop this process, as leasing does not necessarily translate into permitting and production?
Yeah, right now we're seeing a situation of the Interior Department is ignoring its obligations under the Mineral Leasing Act, so I appreciate language to clarify that quarterly actually means quarterly. But they're now using their justification as the Inflation Reduction Act, which is great because at least they have an incentive to lease oil and gas because wind and solar permits are tied to it. But they're starting to play games with the numbers. So the IRA is very clear on 50% of lands nominated need to come up for sale before a wind and solar permit can be issued. But they're playing games on how to count that. And so I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but I do appreciate that you're willing to clarify that language in your bill.
So as this goes directly to, how else can they block our every move here and continue to keep American energy from reaching its full potential and force us to rely on these foreign entities?
Well, we're proud that we produce it more sustainably on public lands than anywhere else because there's so much more regulation and process on public lands. So when we don't produce it from federal lands, we're getting it from overseas or somewhere else where it's not done as sustainably.
Very good. As a follow-up to that, turning now to reforming NEPA delays and the extremely litigious and effective nature of these organizations against this industry regarding NEPA, you mentioned in your testimony that about 6,000 leases are currently being defended due to increased greenhouse gas NEPA analysis. 6,000. Furthermore, you highlight that Congress has not passed any law requiring a carbon budget or the social cost of carbon, yet these leases are still being held up to the NEPA process regarding this criteria. So my question here is very similar to the first one. How can we anticipate and prevent the NEPA process from continuing to be weaponized against those who try to acquire leases for energy resource development and any NEPA clarification that we pass?
I think legislation that would clearly state what type of greenhouse gas analysis is necessary. Because it's very easy right now in court to get a judge to say not enough greenhouse gas analysis was done, and BLM is struggling with this. So the project or the NEPA that Ms. Johnson mentioned regarding leasing, that wasn't because the NEPA wasn't followed or public didn't have input. That's a characterization of NEPA. It's because it's almost impossible not to get a judge to find that there's some deficiency in the NEPA. So no matter how hard and how much BLM studies it, environmental groups are going to continue to sue on greenhouse gas analysis until the analysis results in an answer that says absolutely no oil and gas should be developed because greenhouse gas emissions are created. I mean, we all know that using oil and natural gas creates greenhouse gas emissions, but until there's an alternative that does everything that oil and gas does, just using NEPA to say no greenhouse gas emissions can be emitted from a project, that's not reality. That's shutting down our sources of energy using the NEPA process. So judges can find deficiencies in the NEPA. It gets sent back to BLM to redo that analysis. And we're working with BLM to get that analysis to a place where it can be. Sorry for the long.
That's okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Scama. And Mr. Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlemen's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Stansberry. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome our panelists, and in particular, I want to welcome Ms. Johnson. I just witnessed an exchange, and I wanted to just take a point of personal privilege here and say that we're grateful that you're here. It takes a lot of courage for members of the public to come and testify in front of this body, and I want to remind my colleagues that this is the people's house, not the lobbyist's house. Okay? And that we should really treat members of the public who come before this body with the due respect that they deserve as they come before this body. So this topic is very personal to me. I grew up in a working family, and many people do not know this, but my parents were both energy workers. In fact, my mom was one of the very first women operating engineers in the state of New Mexico, and operated heavy equipment and helped build the San Juan Generating Station, which is the coal-fired power plant that is under energy transition in northwestern New Mexico, and that many of our Diné Navajo community members work at. My father was an oil and gas welder who worked in the oil fields for some of the companies whose lobbyists, I'm sure, are here in this audience today. And when the bottom dropped out of the oil and gas industry in the early 1980s, my parents had to leave Farmington, New Mexico, and move to Albuquerque, which is why I grew up in the city. Because this industry rises and falls on boom and bust cycles, and our working families, our working people, and our communities pay the price for the profits that these industries skim off the top as we ride that wave. And so as I have taken this role as a member of Congress, as a former legislator, and as an American, as a New Mexican who cares deeply about my communities, I see one of my primary responsibilities as ensuring that our communities can make a just and equitable transition, that they have opportunities and investments and a seat at the table so that they are able to participate and not just be subject to the energy industry. So as I take my role as ranking member and oversight, I am hoping to elevate the voices of our communities, to provide opportunities for people who are from our communities to come and testify and participate in these hearings, for the voices of our working people to actually have a seat at the table after decades of not being able to participate in the process. Now, NEPA and permitting is a very select slice of what it means to have energy democracy, as Ms. Johnson has talked about in her testimony. So I really want to take this opportunity to lay out a vision for what we can do through this body, to lift up our communities, to help foster a just transition, to implement the largest investment in climate action ever in the history of this country that this body passed in August of this year, which will make billions of dollars in investments in our communities and help create millions of jobs in states like mine. And if we are smart, and if we are just, and if we are equitable, and we actually pull those chairs around the table and involve our communities in that work, we will have a just, equitable transition that gives people a sustainable life and a sustainable economy. I also plan, of course, through my role on oversight, to meet our trust and treaty obligations to our tribes, to work on public lands and water issues, and to address, of course, the drought that is impacting communities across the West. Because we are in the people's house, because this is what we were elected to do. This is why we are here. So I want to take this opportunity to ask Ms. Johnson once more, I know you've already shared many of your thoughts, can you please share with us your vision and how you see this body can help to empower communities to make a just and equitable transition as we are building a new energy economy?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the acknowledgement and your question. I think because of the rich resources that this body holds, our public lands, it's really critical and important that as you shape policies and practices related to that, that you, as I noted, center environmental justice in those considerations, in those deliberations, and go back to those 3 questions that I mentioned. Are you advancing an energy source or expanding an energy source that creates harm in communities, expands racially disproportionate racial and economic impacts, and harms communities? I think if you keep those 3 questions at the forefront of what you're doing, we will get to that future that you described in your comments.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. And Mr. Chair, thank you for having this hearing, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. Boebert, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a rise and fall in our communities, as Ms. Stansberry pointed out, but it's not just because of the oil and gas industry and the ebbs and flows of that. It's because of politicians and their bad policies that they're forcing on Americans. I know many communities have experienced a very large fall from the rise that they had because they are being regulated into poverty. And, we're not subject to oil and gas. We are subject, unfortunately, to climate extremists, forcing us all to bow at the left's altar of climate change. And I'm very glad that Ms. Stansberry has admitted to the people here in the People's House, the American people, that the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't about reducing inflation. It was the Green New Deal. A con game, title it one way, do another thing, spend money another way. It wasn't to reduce inflation, it was the Green New Deal. Back home in Colorado, I've seen firsthand the harm leftist policies have created in my communities. Colorado's Western Slope used to have a booming energy production. We used to have about 112 rigs operating on the Western Slope, and now we have 4. Extreme leftist policies lock up land. They've driven away good-paying American jobs and have helped drive up gas prices. With the stroke of his pen, Joe Biden waged an all-out war against American energy production, propping up Vladimir Putin on day 1 of his administration, from shutting down the Keystone XL pipeline, imposing new rules to block pipeline projects, canceling oil and gas leases on millions of acres of land in Alaska and in the Gulf of Mexico, imposing a moratorium on new federal oil and gas leases on federal lands, failing to meet the statutory deadlines for quarterly lease sales, and took countless other anti-energy measures that have contributed to increased gas prices and inflation reaching record levels. Rather than shutting down production here at home and begging Iran and Venezuela and OPEC to produce energy for us, we should be producing it right here and relying on the American roughneck, the hardworking American roughneck that you are taking food out of their children's mouths to prop up your energy scams. We do it cleaner and better than anyone else. Now, my first question, thank you, witnesses, for being here today, is for you, Ms. Sagama. Thank you for traveling from Colorado to be with us. You discussed the increased bureaucracy around lease suspensions and permit extensions. What can we in Congress do to ensure that these agencies spend their time reducing the current APD backlog, which sits at almost 5,000, versus haggling over these paperwork exercises?
I appreciate the question. Just specify that an APD term is for 4 years instead of 2. Because right now, when we try to get an extension, we're having to justify it quarterly. So it's a lot of extra paperwork churn. So just make the term 4.
Thank you. Ms. Sagama, we've heard rumblings that the Bureau of Land Management may suspend approving all APDs due to the 10th Circuit's decision last Friday. In your opinion, does the BLM need to do this, or is there a way to address this decision quickly and allow APD approvals?
Yeah, it's really easy to find a NEPA deficiency in court. And in this case, the judge found that BLM didn't consider a carbon budget. There's no law passed by Congress that requires a carbon budget, but BLM could quickly explain that, no, we didn't consider a carbon budget because of that reason I just specified, and it's an easy corrective NEPA fixed. It shouldn't be affecting any other permits in New Mexico or anywhere else.
That does sound like an easy fix, Ms. Sagama. Now, in your testimony, you touch on the 9,000 unused lease permits, leases and permits numbered used by the Biden administration last year when blaming producers for high energy prices. Could you explain, please, to us here today why these leases and permits cannot simply be used?
Well, you're never going to operate on 100% of leases. So right now we're at a 66% utilization rate, and so that's a good high number. So if there's about 12,000 non-producing leases, there are 23,000 producing leases. So that's a good mix, just because sometimes economic resources are not found on a particular lease. When it comes to permits, there are other approvals that are necessary for permits, and we have several held up in court cases. So there are various reasons that a permit doesn't get used immediately.
Thank you very much, Ms. Sagama, and thank you so much to the other witnesses for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I promise I feel better than I sound. My voice has been gone since last night, but I do genuinely look forward to working with you, finding areas of common ground here in the new Congress. I know that we won't agree on everything, but I do know that there will be things that we can agree on. Thank you for the Arkansas spring water as well. That did not go unnoticed. But I really wanted to take a minute and discuss how we can responsibly and sustainably deploy energy on our public lands. I agree that we need to do that. And as we've discussed today, public lands and waters are managed for multiple uses: energy development, mining, recreation, and grazing. But I believe strongly that we have this opportunity to focus not on more record profits for the oil and gas industry for its own sake, but instead to actually prioritize our public lands for purposes that spur on the renewable energy development we're going to need in the coming decades. And I would hope that we could all come together to do that. We've got to minimize conflicts. We've got to support timely decision-making. And we've got to engage in very important land use planning as part of a smart siting effort to identify areas of high renewable energy potential and the lowest environmental friction. And this is all bipartisan policy, and it has been since I've been in Congress. We can responsibly improve the permitting process for clean energy and climate solutions. We can also ensure the meaningful engagement of environmental justice communities. And I share the comments of my friend from New Mexico in applauding your being here. It's why I introduced something called the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act in the last 2 Congresses, or PLREDA for short. It would codify a smart from the start approach to renewable energy development, and it includes measures to facilitate investment in high-quality renewable sources to ensure fair revenue for impacted communities and to minimize impacts to wildlife and to cultural sites. Mr. Sandberg, and again, forgive my voice, I'm grateful for ACP's support on PLREDA. Could you discuss how the legislation would help increase clean energy on public lands while still maintaining thorough environmental and community protections?
Thank you for the question. And as you've outlined, PLREDA is a great first step to help us develop renewables on federal lands. And as you said, focusing on high-quality resources and low-impact areas, so mitigating wildlife impacts, cultural sites, those types of things. And I think that this bipartisan effort can yield good results. As you know, and as we've discussed with your office, since 2015, there's been a very little development, renewable development on federal lands, while there's been a boom on private lands. And so I think there is a great ability and opportunity to expedite and use those resources on federal lands.
And one of the core principles of the legislation is smart from the start planning. Do you agree that's the best planning approach for balancing renewable energy with all the other uses of our public lands, and if so, why?
So we support many of the provisions in your bill, and as part of that, I think that this permitting process and the processes laid out in Florida are a fantastic first step in that process, and we look forward to working with you in this Congress to advance those.
Appreciate that very much, and I would just close, Mr. Chairman, by saying we can spend the next 2 years yelling and screaming at each other and focusing on all that we disagree about. I don't think it's the best use of our time. I don't think it's what our constituents expect, and I think it's incumbent on every one of us here to find areas of common ground and try to move the ball forward in a positive way for our country. So with that, I'll yield back. Sorry, caught you in transition.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Bentz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the witnesses for being here. I think this question eventually will be for Ms. Sagama, but let me just go through some language out of a report regarding the $1 billion that's been thrown at our permitting difficulties, and it seems odd that anybody would dispute that we have permitting difficulties when we threw $1 billion at it to try to fix it. But this language out of a report from Bloomberg says the problem isn't going to get fixed by throwing money at it. Mario Loyola, now senior fellow at Competitive Enterprise Institute, the problem is structural. It's not that we don't have enough people, it's that the permitting process is insane. This little potpourri of odds and ends and these little baskets of money are way too little, way too late. I guess my first question is, true or false? We've got $1 billion. It was suggested by the ranking member that the problem has been addressed. Has it been addressed in a way that's going to make a difference? I'm asking that question.
Oh, I mean, as far as throwing money at it, like, I agree with you. It's about making the parameters of NEPA sane and focusing it on the task at hand.
And how would, and I understand that under the Trump administration, there were steps taken to try to help, and those were then reversed when the Obama administration, when the Biden administration took over. So what should be done? And I know this is the third time you've been asked the question, but.
No problem. I appreciate the question. Really focus NEPA on the impacts from the project, not 10 years of studies on air impacts 200 miles away, or it's got to be the impacts of the project, and it needs to be a tight time frame and making NEPA documents so that the average person can read them and understand what's in them.
So it's long been my thought in watching these processes that they have become politicalized, and thus it's no big surprise that there would be a 10-year delay on a oil or fossil fuel development. But is it your thought that we're going to see less delay when it comes to a green energy project?
You would think so, based on how politically favored wind and solar are, but no, they're facing the same kinds of issues we are in the oil and gas industry.
It's not hugely surprising given the opportunity to litigate and delay and do all the stuff you can do with NEPA, which is a fertile field for we lawyers that choose to engage in those kinds of activities. Do you think this $1 billion in some fashion can be used to try to head off some of that delay? I'm on the Judiciary Committee. I often think we should be looking at means of reducing the delay opportunities inside civil procedure, for example.
I think it would probably take other legislation, because right now judges are just, you can take a 5,000-page NEPA document and you can find a judge that's going to say, oh wait, this analysis here wasn't done quite the way it should have been done.
Yeah.
Forget that it's highly complex.
Let me hop to some of the suggestions that I've read about what we might do in the alternative to that, which we now have. One is pre-approval of project sites. Another is competitive net zero grants to states. The third is federal energy corridors. Now, federal energy corridors leads me to calling something out that people seem to ignore, and that is the incredible cost of green energy when it comes to transmission. And I don't want to say I'm amused. I think I'm discouraged by the fact that if we're going to have a clean energy future, it means that our nation is going to be crisscrossed with all kinds of 500 kilowatt power lines. I've had one run through my district back in Oregon. 15 years to permit. No surprise, nobody wants a 500 kV line going through their backyard. So I'm just curious though, why don't we hear more from the green energy advocates about this cost? Because it is a cost, I guarantee it, when you suddenly turn a bucolic, rural neighborhood into an industrial transmission site. So what's your thoughts there? Do you think that this federal energy corridors is a good idea?
I'm not as familiar as with that because I focus, my producers are at just the wellhead, but I think Mr. Sandberg maybe could answer that question better than
Sandberg, we have 20 seconds. You have 20 seconds. You have 15.
14, 13. I think that transmission build-out is important, not just to clean energy, but to all generation sources. I think we need more of it. I do agree that there are common sense reforms that can be part of this package that can expedite the permitting of those projects.
Thank you. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Luna. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. The Biden administration has launched a war on energy, which really means a war on the resources that Americans need to live productive, meaningful lives. We need to produce more domestic oil, natural gas, and nuclear energy. These natural resources are the bounty of our nation and should be responsibly extracted for the benefit of the American people. Increased production keeps energy costs low, supports good-paying jobs, and advances American energy independence from foreign nations and strengthens our national security. Unfortunately, since day one, President Biden has chosen to punish Americans, first by revoking the permit for the Keystone Pipeline, which could have supplied the U.S. with over 830,000 barrels of oil per day. According to the Bureau of Land Management, there are currently 4,609 permits for drilling on federal lands that await this administration's approval. Many of these can be approved today, allowing companies to move forward with oil development. In addition, there are 8,295 outstanding approved permits that are unable to be developed due to the administration's regulatory framework that has constrained oil and gas production, which is very telling based on his speech last night. Maximizing energy production in America will limit the need to import from other nations, reduce high energy costs, create jobs domestically, and in my opinion, protect the environment. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to insert these graphics into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Ms. Sagama, are the Biden administration's policies having the effect of increasing energy abundance or constraining our nation's energy portfolio?
I would say it's constraining.
Mr. Sandberg, which kind of countries develop and innovate more clean power solutions, prosperous ones or poor ones?
I think the innovation is led mostly by the developed world.
Thank you. It's clear that the Biden administration and radical left want to impoverish Americans with pushing energy costs, but let's talk about who they're rewarding. Behind me, you guys can see a chart, and it has China leading the world in the highest CO2 emissions. In fact, China's 2021 emissions were about equal to the emissions of the US, EU, and India combined. In 2021, China consumed about 44,000 terawatt hours of energy with 0.26 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt per hour, while the US consumed 26,000 terawatt hours of energy with 0.19 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour. Ms. Johnson, your testimony calls for considering cumulative impacts of greenhouse gas emissions. Are you aware that China emissions would be more than double the US, and does Chinese CO2 molecules not count towards a cumulative impact on our planet?
That's not a question I feel capable of answering.
I'm asking you that, though, because with your opinion, which I do respect, we're talking about how we can best, I think, preserve our community and the environment. And when we send our production and our oil overseas, when we're enabling countries with foreign policy that are destroying the planet, I think that it's very applicable to this committee. So please answer the question.
It's not a question that I feel capable of answering.
According to the chart behind me, since you don't want to comply, China's destroying our environment. Our current foreign policy is enabling China. And it's clear that with this administration, that for those who are advocating for climate justice, that are those who are advocating for climate change, are failing to acknowledge that they are empowering through foreign policy and through an administration that is limiting our ability here in the United States to produce clean energy. They are empowering a country that is going to destroy us all. Thank you, Chairman. I yield my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for being here today. Ms. Sagama, thank you for your testimony today and for representing our western states. I want to focus on one specific part of your written testimony because I think it carries the most weight. You state that when the federal regulation and process becomes unbalanced with the goal of producing the energy the Interior Department manages on behalf of all Americans, then we have a situation where the federal government is purposely preventing federal production, resulting in higher prices for consumers, more foreign imports, less energy security, etc. What you are describing is energy poverty. Energy poverty imposed on the American people by a burdensome federal structure which Joe Biden has weaponized. Nearly half of Wyoming is owned by the federal government, as is over 60% of its mineral estate. When Joe Biden weaponizes his control of federal lands, he is targeting Wyoming and the Americans we serve. Wyoming produces 13 times more energy than it consumes and is the second biggest net energy supplier among the 50 states. I think one of the biggest disconnects for Washington, D.C. and Americans not from the West is to truly understand how substantial the federal presence in our community is and the impact it has on developing the resources we have, which the nation so relies upon. Americans are facing the most expensive heating bills in 25 years. Food prices are up 10% from the previous year. Gas prices in November 22 were the highest ever, and nearly 34% of American households reduced or skipped basic expenses to pay energy bills. Do you have similar statistics for the cost of Biden administration's policies on energy producers?
Well, I think there was a study done that showed we would be producing 2 to 3 million more barrels a day in the United States now if President Trump's policies had been followed and not President Biden's. And that equates to us having to send $100 billion overseas so that we can get energy in to make up for that difference. So it's much better to produce it here. And if you look at where oil and gas is produced in Wyoming and across the West, it is certainly in remote areas, not near disadvantaged communities. So we also have that added benefit in Wyoming.
Thank you. And would you agree that this is forced energy poverty on the American people and producers?
Well, I think if these goals are ultimately brought to their conclusion, it would result in more energy scarcity. People are trying to electrify everything and get rid of natural gas. And if you take that policy to its conclusion, then when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we don't have electricity. So that's scarcity, that's not being able to run your ICU, that's not being able to turn the lights on. So that has a lot of ramifications beyond, if these policies were taken to the ultimate conclusion. I believe that Americans are not going to let that happen, though.
Well, the reality is that energy security is national security. Affordable energy is the key to our prosperity. Affordable energy is key to affordable housing and affordable food production. Increasing the cost of energy affects our poorer communities the most. It is in reality a terribly regressive tax imposed by those who can most easily afford it and who don't suffer its consequences. The bottom line for me, I believe that there is a special place in hell for those people who push policies that are intended to increase the cost of housing, food, and energy. I yield back.
Did the gentlelady yield back?
Yes, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a committee hop here,
go from Waters of the United States regulations over in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to figuring out what to do about NEPA. It seems it's just about every angle possible to stop people from doing what they need to do, even though they know how to do it ecologically soundly pretty much these days. So let me launch into a thought here on, I know we're covering very good ground on energy and on mineral extraction and such, extremely important. I'd also like to hit a related area, at least to me as well, in Northern California, or forest management, and what NEPA's effect is on that. So let me maybe pose this to Dana Johnson here as our witness on NEPA being used as a tool basically to delay very important Forest Service thinning projects, timber harvest, things that are important for the local economy, for local forest health, simple things in a forested area of replacing a pipe, replacing a culvert, so that a forest road could be maintained and utilized for many purposes. What do you think the really, when you look at that on the NEPA being required for a culvert and every simple thing, what do you think are the real consequences for these delays on the people of my district that have just suffered a million-acre fire in 2021 and the Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise in 2018, the Bear Fire, nearly adjacent to Paradise, destroyed 2 very small mountain communities. When we're talking about the reforms that were proposed back in 2020, is NEPA in the right place now, or 2020 type of reforms reasonable in the context of what we're doing to our forest in the mountain communities?
So my area of expertise is not in forestry and mountain communities, but I will broadly say that a NEPA that does not provide opportunity for public comment periods, that doesn't proactively consider alternatives in environments, doesn't consider cumulative impacts, doesn't consult with those who are impacted, is a NEPA that does not work for people and does not work for communities.
Well, it seems the people that are wanting this consultation aren't living in the communities that are burning down upon the people's heads there, like Greenville and Canyon Dam and Paradise and Magalia, Concal, Yankee Hill. They seem to come from somewhere else. They bring lawyers in from the coast and stop decent timber harvest projects, or as more pertinent to the topic here as well, that mineral extraction we're going to need in this country to keep up with the mandates that are coming for replacing all types of fuel with electricity. Electricity stoves being the latest one, getting rid of all manner of yard tools and such. So is NEPA going to be helpful in having the voices of so many overwhelming the rural voices that live in these areas where the minerals are extracted, where the timber is needing to be thinned?
So NEPA is a place-based policy. It takes a look at, it assesses a project in the place where it will be implemented. I can't speak to where people are coming from in defense of that, but if applied appropriately, NEPA would take into account the people living in the rural communities that you are uplifting.
Yeah, so frequently it does not. It runs over them. For Kathleen Sagama, has looking at back to the energy grid, and everything involves energy. It's so important. It's a cornerstone. It's why the cost of everything has gone up so much, as we've stopped developing energy, and energy costs have skyrocketed so much for gasoline, diesel, natural gas, even electricity, as they try to take out hydroelectric dams in my district, one of them being in Mr. Bentz's district, and getting rid of the supply of electricity. From your perspective, has the Biden administration found any way to be helpful in energy production or the manufacturing?
We have seen purposeful obstacles put in place of oil and natural gas development. I would guess they're being helpful to wind and solar.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to find. Mr. Chairman, I've already run myself out of time, so I'll have to pop to it a different time. Thank you, sir.
Gentleman yields back his 1 second. The chair recognizes the ranking member for 5 minutes, Mr. Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for participating today. Mr. Gama, let me just a quick question. Do you see in the portfolio of unleashing America's energy and mineral potential per the agenda for this meeting, do you see as part of that portfolio, unleashing portfolio, do you see royalty relief for gas and oil as one of those items that needs to be considered by Congress?
We believe in paying a fair share of royalties. Absolutely, we pay royalties. We're very proud to provide that royalty back to the American taxpayer.
So relief is not on the agenda from the...
No, no.
That's good to know, because that will be one less item that we have to deal with. The other issue I was going to ask is, Ms. Johnson, and thank you, and good to see you again. We've talked a lot about, and the questions that have been directed at you, and I think you've more than informed all of us as to not only WEAC, but the issue of environmental justice, and that it must be front and center. My question is that all the impacts, health, lack of participation, systemic land use decision that leads to discriminatory practices at other levels for the communities that you represent and you speak for. My question is the economic issue. It's been brought up in every other conversation here. But let's talk about the economic issue and your experience relative to the communities that we're talking about and that you represent, frontline communities. What's that economic reality for those neighborhoods and those communities?
Yeah, I think that the economic reality is that we have higher health costs in those communities. We see reduced number of school days and work days associated with health impacts. We see environmental degradation that leads to lower property values. We see people not making a wage that is appropriate and sustainable. But on the flip side of that, I think that we see positive economic opportunity coming in this conversation that we are having about how do we ensure that we have a sustainable, affordable, accessible, robust energy economy. To do that does not mean that we forsake projects, whether they are traditional or clean, environmental processes, whether we are considering a traditional or a clean energy project. Again, as was mentioned, there are resources in the Inflation Reduction Act that we believe will provide staffing, that will provide opportunities to modernize and streamline our system and processes, and that we can get energy economic opportunities deployed in an equitable and just way at a proper pace, because we have invested in it in a robust way during the during the previous legislative session.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sandberg, I just need a point of clarification. You said that permitting reform should not mean undercutting our environmental standards, and I agree with you on that. But also in your testimony, speaking in support of TAP, America's Energy Act, you support that piece of legislation. But the bill expressly undercuts our most fundamental environmental standards. That's NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. It weakens requirements for assessing environmental and public health impacts in many ways, and even worse, it would exempt numerous energy projects from the NEPA review. So while I agree with your statement that I said earlier, I would respectfully want a clarification do you urge a closer look? The contradiction in supporting what is essentially the gutting of NEPA in one piece of legislation and the comments that you made.
Thank you for the question. I think there are ways to make common sense reforms to NEPA, and I think that working with the Congress, we have faith that the Congress can do that. And I think that the TAP Act is one example. There are others out there that, working with you and others, we can find a way to streamline the process without undercutting, as you said, our bedrock environmental statutes.
A 2020 study, according to that 2020 study, that was 1 out of every 450 NEPA reviews are ever challenged in court. Do you consider that? Do you consider that a factor in? I know that it's been exaggerated to the point that everything ends up in court, and that people are that NEPA is a tool to slow everything down, which is not true. But 1 out of every 450, do you consider that too much, excessive?
I think to meet our shared goals of accelerating clean energy deployment and the economic and environmental benefits that will come from that, that there are some things that need to happen to streamline the process for permitting.
Does that include
reach our
denying
goals,
people
shared
the
goals.
redress in court?
Pardon?
Does that include denying people redress in court?
No,
Which
sir.
is their right?
It does not.
Yield back, and I'm sorry. Excuse me.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Fulcher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And to the panel, thank you for being here and for your testimony and your input. You probably know this, but just in case not, please don't mistake our coming and going as a rudeness or lack of interest. It's called the dueling committees that sometime pop up on the schedule. And so I just wanted to clarify that and let you know you're appreciated. A question for Ms. Sagama.
We're here.
Ms. Sagama, in your written testimony, you talked about an onslaught of regulatory overreach coming. You may have already discussed this, but I'm going to ask you to touch on that again. What's coming? But we think, personally, I think there's too much now, but what should be watching for?
Yeah, I probably should have used a different tense. Yeah, absolutely. We are facing duplicate rulemakings right now. We just finished one up from BLM and now one with EPA. The financial regulators we can't keep up with all that they're throwing at the industry, meant to deny financing to oil and natural gas projects from Department of Labor, SEC, Department of Treasury. All kinds of regulations are coming out. Nobody can even keep up with it.
Okay, so Committee on Natural Resources, if you were king for a day and could tell us to focus in on one particular area as a priority, what would it be?
NEPA.
Okay. Well, that's a good setup for the next question, because I have one for Mr. Sandberg in regard to NEPA. I'm from the state of Idaho, and so if you know anything about our natural resource base there, you know that we're no stranger to NEPA. And you have been speaking about some potential changes to that. I'm going to go down a similar path with you. First of all, where there are cumbersome components of NEPA, do you see the impact of that to be more negative from a cost standpoint or a time standpoint, first of all? And then, same question, king for a day, you can focus in on one particular area to improve it. What would it be? So 2-point question, cost or time, and what's the priority that we should be going after?
Well, I thank you for the question. I think it's both. I think it has a cost component, it has a time component, neither of which are helpful to deployment of clean energy. And so as I lead into your second part of your question, if I was king for a day, I think we just need to work on shortening. I think if we could shorten timelines, that would be a good first step.
Litigation? See, litigation is an issue, and if so, could you comment on that?
I don't have a comment on litigation.
Okay, all right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Carl, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Is it Milito? Melito. All right. I'm from South Alabama, so you got to work with me here a little bit. As you know, the Biden administration has canceled the 3 remaining leases in the Gulf, lease sales on the offshore 5-year plan that expired June the 30th, 2022. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management only resumed planning sales at the direction of Congress in the Inflation Reduction Act. BOEM has so far failed to publish any new 5-year plan, leaving the U.S. without a long-term plan for oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico, which supplies over 20% of our oil reserves. 20% is in limbo right here. Why is oil and natural gas production in the Gulf of Mexico critical to our ability to meet the growing demand, and why is it necessary to continue planning for the future with regular lease sales in the Gulf?
There's many reasons why production from the Gulf of Mexico is so important to Americans. First of all, it's a reliable supply of energy. We need to use oil and gas in our economy. The global economy requires it. If you look back in 2021, we were still importing oil from Russia, and we hit actually 500,000 barrels a day of imports from Russia in August of 2021. On the other hand, we have the Gulf of Mexico, which is a crown jewel of energy production, and we have an opportunity to increase production from 1.8 million barrels up to 2.4 million barrels of production if we have the opportunity to move forward with leasing and permitting. Further, the Gulf of Mexico provides high-paying jobs. These jobs are throughout the country, mostly along the Gulf Coast, but these are very high-paying jobs, and they're not just college degree jobs. These are blue-collar jobs that are available for communities along the Gulf Coast. Another thing I'd like to add is that we've been supportive of revenue sharing. And if you look back at the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, which was passed in 2006, that law provided the funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund to come from offshore oil and gas development. So we've paid through offshore oil and gas development in the Gulf over $5 billion for parks, wildlife, recreational projects throughout the country, and that's over 40,000 projects. Also, as part of that fund, there's a what's called the what's it called? It's a program that is designed to send money into underprivileged and urban areas for parks and recreation.
Is that part of the Go Mesa money?
It's part of the Go Mesa money. So there's been tens of millions of dollars annually now going to fund parks and recreation and wildlife programs for underprivileged communities in urban areas throughout the country. So we have all these benefits, and this is a region that provides among the lowest carbon barrels of oil in the world. All U.S. production provides better oil when it comes to low carbon intensity, but the Gulf of Mexico really provides the best. So if we're going to get it, let's get it from here where we know we can secure these benefits rather than seeing that production go to other parts of the world, which harms our national security.
I'm glad you touched on the Go Mesa money. I was a county commissioner for 8 years, and we depended on that Go Mesa money, and where we actually used it was restoring shorelines, oyster beds, all these environmental projects that were created over time, and we were able to restore them. We actually purchased property. We've got some stuff I'm thinking down on Dolphin Islands Park and Recreation. That's for the public to use. All of this is publicly used. So when you start talking about reducing the output in the Gulf, you're talking about reducing that Go Mesa money, which affects Mobile and Baldwin County. I'll speak for Alabama. It reduces money in both of those. So it just amazes me how we will buy Russian oil, which is much dirtier, and it's got to cost more to actually get it here because we've got oil right at our back door, as well as natural gas. We have a tremendous amount of natural gas off Alabama shores. So it's frustrating for me as being a representative from the Gulf Coast and see what has happened over the last 2 years. We have got to get, we have so many rules and regulations. Everybody says, well, there's 7,000 leases. That's hogwash. There's 7,000 leases and 699,000, whatever the breakdown of the numbers, it is all tied up in permit. It's an environmental nightmare trying to get through all of this. But anyway, I appreciate your comments. I appreciate you bringing up Go Mesa. You kind of hit the softball for me on that one.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, return back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Virginia, Ms. Kiggins. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I represent Virginia, the Eastern Shore, Virginia Beach, and a lot of the Chesapeake Bay region. So Virginians know how to be good stewards of the environment without sacrificing jobs or hurting our economy. Not only is the Chesapeake Bay watershed home to roughly 3,600 species of plants and animals, but also provides countless economic and recreational opportunities, generating $33 billion each year. So Mr. Melito and Mr. Sandberg, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management recently announced the draft environmental impact statement for an offshore wind project off the coast of Virginia Beach, creating the potential for new job opportunities and economic growth for Virginians. The wind industry is growing along the Atlantic coast and provides opportunities to diversify our energy production. But Virginia's fishing community and tourism economy are also crucial to our economic well-being, and critical military training exercises take place off our coastline. How is the wind industry engaging with and accommodating concerns of these stakeholders to ensure balanced access to the outer continental shelf?
Considering the balancing needs of all the different offshore industries and stakeholders is very important to our industry. I do like to point to the Gulf of Mexico experience because we've been developing energy resources there for decades in a compatible way with military, tourism, commercial, recreational fishing. So we have the experience. We've been able to do that very well. And we've seen that also in the development of the wind industry throughout Europe. So the process that we've seen as it has moved forward is a collaborative process. It's through NEPA and it's through the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, where all the different stakeholders are able to weigh in and provide their thoughts in a deliberative way to make sure that we're allowing all users to be able to move forward with their activities with as little interruption as possible. And one thing I like to point to is the industry working together to find a way to separate the wind turbines to the greatest extent possible so that there's enough space for all users, but we're also able to build up a wind farm that will provide the wind capacity to power the grid at shoreside. So there's a lot that goes into it. The companies that are moving forward with developing these projects work closely with the communities, with the state leaders, with the federal family to make sure that we're doing everything we can to address all the competing needs.
And how is the regulatory process under NEPA impacting timelines for offshore wind leasing and construction, and what can this committee do to better the certainty in the NEPA process?
I think a lot of this is going to come down to making sure we do have guide rails on the NEPA analysis to make sure that we don't have a process that is never ending and that can ultimately always lead to a challenge in court and, depending on the judge, strike down a project or delay it and send it back. I will say that there are already multiple lawsuits filed against the early mover wind projects in the Atlantic, multiple lawsuits. So there's a lot of concern about that because those lawsuits could have an impact on the ones that are in line behind them, depending upon how they shake out. So we need to make sure that the agencies have a framework with some guide rails, and we need to also look at the remedies available to the court to make sure that we're not stifling investment and putting companies in a position to want to invest elsewhere in the world rather than here.
Right. Thank you. And Ms. Sugama, while I recognize the importance of the offshore wind industry to my district and other coastal communities, it does nothing to financially support federal conservation efforts, so unlike the oil and gas industry. As you know, the Great American Outdoors Act directs roughly $1.9 billion in energy development royalties to conservation efforts across the country, including national parks and wildlife refuges, as well as permanently funding the Land and Water Conservation Fund at $900 million annually. In fact, 94% of federal conservation efforts are funded exclusively by royalties from oil and gas industry leases and production. So with the Biden administration slowing the permitting process, limiting production leases, and overregulating the oil and gas industry, what are the expected impacts on conservation efforts over the next decade, and how can we ensure that funding remains available for the conservation of our coastal communities?
I really appreciate that because I think that's something that does get lost is if we took oil and natural gas development to zero on federal lands, that would take away that $2.8 billion federal lands and waters that goes into conservation with no replacement for it because right now wind provides something, I think it provided something like $5 million, whereas we provide billions of dollars. So there's no, if you took away oil and gas, that conservation funding dries up.
So there would be none, pretty much, for our coastal communities for conservation efforts.
I mean, if these policies were ultimately taken to their conclusion, which I don't really see happening, but yes, if you didn't continue to produce more on federal lands and waters, eventually that money would go to zero.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time's expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony today, and I want to circle back kind of to where I started with the chart behind me. We face a challenge here in the United States. The world faces a challenge, and it goes back to this insatiable appetite for energy. And the title of today's hearing is Unleashing Energy and Mineral Potential, and we're talking about that potential that we have here in the U.S. And probably to the surprise of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it's not all fossil fuels that are represented at the witness table today. We have we have full representation of the many kinds of energy that are available and that need to be developed here in the U.S. And as I've listened here and I think about the purpose of this hearing, the purpose of the hearing is to inform the committee as we prepare to write legislation or to have oversight to address the issues that need to be addressed. And the word that came out probably more than any other word from both sides of the aisle was NEPA. It came out with all the witnesses. So we're talking about regulatory reform, and when it's hard to talk about energy development, whether you're talking about traditional energy or energy of the future, without talking about the regulatory environment and the potential need to reform that regulatory environment. We have data that shows that the time to get a permit ebbs and flows. It was up close to 200 days on average under the Obama administration. It got down to as low as 94 days on average in the Trump administration. Nothing changed in the bedrock environmental laws that we talk about. Sounds more like it's a will to do the job that these federal employees are hired to do, and that is to permit. I come from a background of doing engineering projects, so I was on the other side of permitting issues, and I know how frustrating it can be when you're doing everything possible to follow the law, to make sure that the public interest is protected, that the environment is protected, and yet you're totally bogged down in the slowness of the environmental permitting process. So as we look at this, it's not about permitting for extractive industries like the fossil fuel industry. It's not about just permitting for renewable. It's about creating a process that allows America to win. And I want to ask the two witnesses who represent both fossil fuel, traditional energy, and renewable energies, do you see any kind of discrimination in the permitting process based on the type of project that's being permitted?
No, I do not, sir. I believe that the impediments to energy development through some of these laws are being applied to every energy source out there.
I would agree with that.
Ms. Sagama, do you think that the fossil fuel industry is discriminated against in any way in the permitting process?
Well, we're certainly targeted, that's for sure. I don't have a perspective because I don't try to permit wind and solar.
And the point's been made several times in the hearing today that the demand for energy is not going down, it's going up. And that energy has to come from somewhere. And we know that if we don't produce it here in the United States, then the market is going to cause us to import that energy. And we're going to have another hearing on minerals, which gets all into the renewable energy component of it. If we don't have the ability to produce the products to do renewable energy here in the U.S., we're going to import that, which means we're exporting wealth. So as to inform the committee, and Ms. Johnson, I appreciate your testimony on how We don't need to do away with NEPA. Maybe NEPA needs to change, and there's considerations that need to be taken into that, but I don't think anybody in the hearing said we need to file a bill to do away with NEPA. As a matter of fact, Ms. Dingle, whose husband wrote NEPA, she was one of the first ones to say the law needs to be updated. So we'll start with Ms. Sagama and go across the or the witness table. What is the one thing you would say the committee needs to focus on in regulatory reform?
Like I said, NEPA, but I think I would suggest looking at the litigation angle and working to give judges guidance that endless NEPA and endless analysis is not the intent of NEPA.
And could you be just a little more specific on NEPA? Is it a timing process? Are there flaws in the structure of NEPA that we need to change? Or what is it specifically about NEPA that could make it work better?
Well, when you look at litigation, it's really easy to find some analysis in a 5,000-page document that could have been done better. And it's supposed to be done on the best available information, not waiting years and years for more information to come in or requiring the project proponent to go off and do a science project and come back 10 years later. So I would say constraining it to what the focus is of the impacts on the ground of that project, not hypothetical impacts 10 years in the future.
Thank you. Ms. Johnson?
Thank you. I would say we need to consider cumulative impact. If it was reasonable for us to consider it in the 1970s when NEPA was established or signed into law, industry growth and expansion make these considerations all the more pressing today. Again, it's a false narrative for us to suggest that cumulative impact analysis is too costly, that it takes too much time, when we have more tools and data available today than we've ever had before. And to fail to consider existing hazards along with potentially new ones will turn a blind eye to those who have a history, a legacy of being harmed by our energy policies and practices.
So your position is that we need to add more to NEPA? Is there anything you would suggest?
Cumulative impact analysis is a part of the environmental assessment process, and I think we need to preserve it, is what I'm suggesting.
So that's an administrative rule that was not in the original NEPA document. Are you saying we should codify that?
So it's a part to do an environmental assessment to consider what the impact of a project in coordination with projects that are already on the ground is a core part of NEPA that is already there. It's already a part of the law. We just need to be sure we're doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Sandberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think an important and a great first step would just be time-bounding some of the reviews. And I think that's a good place to start. I think kind of really refocusing on purpose and need and that the review kind of centers on that is another important step. But I would say for us, like really that certainty around timing is critical.
Thank you, Mr. Melito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would encourage the committee to look more broadly and outside the box a little bit and see if there's ways we can get to yes faster. We have a tendency in the federal bureaucracy to look at things in silos. It's oil and gas, it's wind, it's carbon capture and storage. We have companies that are very innovative and looking to deploy large amounts of capital to build these energy projects. And an energy project might include oil and gas offshore. It might include wind. It might include carbon capture and storage, and it might include hydrogen. It might include all those as part of a major project that can help the U.S. lead in decarbonization efforts, but also provide the energy we need today based on the foundational energy sources our economy uses. The problem is we don't have a system set up to do something like that. You either got an oil and gas project, you either got a wind project, or a CCS project, or a hydrogen project. So we should work together to find ways to get to yes faster, because if you look in Europe, they can look at a project like that and do it much quicker in terms of getting that approved. You have 70 CCS projects that are under development right now in Europe. A lot of those offshore. We're not at that point yet because we have a bureaucracy that kind of holds things up.
So that's a good point to streamline the permitting for new technologies, and I'm constantly encouraged by new technologies. When you talk about carbon capture, there's now technology to strip the carbon off of the carbon dioxide, release the oxygen, put the carbon in a slurry, inject it into the ground, and it solidifies into a rock. That's real carbon capture and sequestration, and we should be pushing the innovation and pushing the permitting process to be able to get new technology like that online sooner than later. Again, I thank the witnesses. This concludes our first panel, and we're going to take a 10-minute recess. We'll start back at about 1:15 with the second panel. That'll give us time to switch out the witness table.